Hello and most welcome everybody to the lecture 740. We are presently in the local library in Vårgårda, circa 7 or 8 Swedish miles. That would be the equivalence of, I'd say, 35 English miles from Gothenburg. So we are in the stick, so to speak. We had a lovely day here, was some sunshine in the morning, and the sun actually came out to say goodbye to us. We are not very well endowed with sunshine this time of year, I'm afraid. So we are really happy with the little one we got. And I'm going to try something new today, inspired by my colleague, to do an impromptu lecture. Hopefully use what I already have, my material that's been printed out, and we see what's happened. But what sparked my interest was a little story I heard in the car going here. And the lecture will be called The History of Monosemism. And what do I mean by that? Well, our little invention, the word monosemic, means that a sort of an idea or perception, or I would say even an embodiment, that words only have one singular meaning and nothing else. And we will look into that. How did this idea start, if it is an idea? And how does it work? Yeah, we're going to look into it. We're going to do a little micro investigation. I'm alluding here to the good old Ludwig Wittgenstein, but don't take it too literally. I'm going to do what I can, not comparing myself to the great philosopher at all. Well, what are the perceived traits of monosemism? Well, you have an idea somewhere that you get stability in the words somehow. You also have a sort of permanence. Even if a word were to disappear, the meaning would be there. So you don't have to worry if the words changes. The meaning is still there somewhere. So you can still express whatever you want. And another thing is the giving of meaning. It's sort of a gift that the words get endowed with a meaning. So not just words, they also have a meaning somehow. So those, I would say, are the major traits. They are sort of helping tools to make the language work. Otherwise, it will sort of shiver or collapse even. A language without meaning would be very, very disastrous. And somehow, actually, when I mention this is an impromptu lecture, I have to tell you something that I remember now. When I was studying linguistics, I made up one day, and we discussed it, if there could be a language that didn't have any meaning. And we even tried it on the teacher. We told her that we found a language, I don't know, somewhere, Indonesia, but that language doesn't refer to anything. And I remember the discussion that erupted after this. Great confusion, of course. What do you mean it doesn't refer? Well, we said even on newspapers, but the newspapers, the written word in these newspapers, they don't refer to anything. They don't have any meaning. There's no intention, as the word is. Intention with an S in linguistics. Extension being the word itself, and intention is the intended meaning. And somebody in the end said, of course that's impossible. And I remember now, that was actually half Wittgensteinian way. It's to produce an example in the real world and look at it. Would it work? And I'd say it wouldn't work. I would say it would be impossible to have a language that doesn't have intention. And if it's impossible not to have intention, I would actually say it would be also impossible to have intention in language. If you can't take it away, it doesn't serve any purpose. It's something extra, it's a complement. And this is the good thing why we've been studying so hard, because you learn some fundamental rules or hints, I might say. And when you discover a complement, something extra, we know, be careful, look out. Why has somebody added something to language to help it work, like stilts or something like that? And without those things, the language would collapse somehow. Because that was actually the example, this collapsing language that we invented as an example, somewhere in Indonesia. And people were reading the newspapers, but it didn't have any intention. Think about it. Try to embody this idea. The Indonesians sitting with a cup of coffee and they smoke a cigarette and reading a newspaper, but he doesn't have any intention. He has the words. The words sort of emulated by themselves. Well, people started to speak somewhere in the history of Indonesia, and then it turned out a language, but that language never meant anything. So this is the first point. If you find a complement somewhere, be cautious. Then something is usually wrong. And the first one who mentioned this, I think it was when I read Derrida, French philosopher, and his treatise of Saussure. And Saussure had this idea that language had two parts as well. One was the actual word, and the other one was what it meant. And that pair was very important for language to work properly. And Derrida started looking at that. What is the working principle in Saussure? Yes, that's that the signs and what the sign is for are different. So all the signs need to be different in some way. And then Derrida sort of dwindled further. Well, then the things in the world have to be different as well. Yeah, sort of, you think. How are you sure that the difference in language and the difference in the world are the same? Wouldn't you need an extra rule to be sure that the difference, because you have obvious differences in the world, you have the difference between the thermos and the pen. They need to be different both in the world, but they need to have a similar difference in language. This is the genius with Derrida. This is very visual. Even if it's written text, it's very visual. And you start to think, no, there's a dog buried here somewhere. That doesn't make sense. Saussure never thought about that. And Derrida showed that maybe when you're trying to have this meaning-giving process, that would go on forever. Because if I say something, I use a word, I want to say thermos, somehow my body, my mind needs to go through all differences. And it's not enough to compare my thermos to a cup or other thermoses. I need to compare it to the whole world. And that would take forever. So there is things here that doesn't sound true. But it will get worse for the history of monosemism. Somebody that is not as, how would you say, elegant as Jacques Derrida. He's careful and he's trying to be nice. He uses visual. Someone who's not so nice is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's tougher. His examples are not only visual, they are practical. So it's easier to get into it once you learn how, because you need to do his ideas, you need to do his examples. One is very famous, it's about these people putting up a wall. And once you're starting to do that in your mind, or actually do it, you understand, it will be very hard to have a separation between meaning and word. And what Derrida meant in the end, that we are misusing language. And one could actually say one clear misuse I can pinpoint directly. It's the word meaning. The word meaning has its job, its action, what you should do with it, because talking is an action. And to use meaning on all words, that's not fair. That's not how the word meaning started once upon a time, because we did not start out as linguists. It was not first a linguistic term and then language developed. So meaning has a very specific use in normal language. By misusing that word and say it means only one, that's against the rules of language. It's not sensible. You create a problem that was never there from the beginning. You end up not with a problem, but rather confusion. It's a misuse of language. And according to Wittgenstein, you will end up in problems if you start misusing language. You might even lose your elegancy, your perfection in language, and you start to not always making sense. Well, I studied enough philosophy to recognize that trait, both in myself, which is hard, but particularly among other people. I don't know how many philosophical discussions we had, and someone's view doesn't really make any sense, and that person himself doesn't know what he's trying to say. That's misuse of language. That's little bit like using a screwdriver when you need a wrench. You won't get out the screw if you use the wrong tool. You need to have the right tool. And language could be said in a very crude way. This is not to be taken literally, but it's more akin to tools, action, verbs, doing things, rather than this absolutely static picture of language. And if Derrida would say you end up in enormous problems, Wittgenstein would say you are not even making sense. It doesn't even mean anything to say that the word is a monosemic word. And you don't know yourself what you're trying to say. And I would look at the psychology, because that's the way to go about. Well, in a way, meanings are preferred to properties. So this could give the impression it's easier. You don't have to think about properties. Properties are very terrible. A word has a pronunciation. It needs to be used in a correct way. There's so many things with words. Meanings are actually a bit easier in a way. So this could actually appeal to our laziness. But this is even more interesting. Referring rather than perceiving. Well, when you refer, it's an automatic process somehow. But that's probably what people think, or this is what monosemism thinks itself. And perceiving, it's actually more active in a way. You need to actively understand what something means. You need to put some effort. Referring is so much easier. Well, you don't have to even use your body or your implicit knowledge. Worst case scenario, instead of really understand what's being said, you go to a dictionary. You go to a dictionary when you're talking your own language. Something is rather wrong here. Well, in exceptional cases you could do that, but you're not supposed to do that constantly. It means that you don't have the meaning. My intuition tells me directly, there's no dictionary in the world who can give it exact meaning than the people using the language. It would make even sense. Of course, a dictionary can be helpful sometimes. I'm not criticizing them. But having this idea, you can get the meanings from a dictionary. For God's sake, language is the world. There's no shortcut here. You can't sit in your chamber and say, I will understand the whole world, therefore I bought the National Encyclopedia. I have all 30 volumes at home. And this is actually true when it comes to a friend of mine. Language, in a sense, I would say, is the world. Is nothing less than the world. It cannot be less than the world because it's everything we do. Otherwise, you have to start thinking language somehow was produced separately, somewhere else. And this is the second time we remember what we learned, and now there is a red alert. When something is otherworldly, when it's transcendent, supposed to be not in this world, but somewhere else, that's a problem. And that's why I've written transcendence here. Yes, of course, monosemism has a pal, or a mother, you could say, mother and a father together. And that is some sort of transcendentalism, some otherworldliness, or why not the reflective consciousness? Yeah, reflective consciousness. Transcendence. Yeah. No, Wittgenstein would say the language is our life world, is everything we do. Everything we interact with other people, how I interact with the environment, how I interact with myself, everything in the world. Even the little lemurs in Madagascar are part of reality. Everything is part of reality. Nothing can be excluded and say, well, those things are not really part of the world. When did you last hear that expression? Somebody told you. No, I would say those things are not part of the world. Just mentioning them makes them, in some sense, part of the world. Once something is mentioned, thought of, it's part of the world already. Let me give you an example. We were the other day, and this is when I got this idea, I realized now. We were talking about an animal that visited us at night, and that animal had dirty paws, so it left a mark on the terrace. And that animal was a marten. And when I told my colleague about this marten, I later realized that will create something in him already. Although he doesn't know what a marten is, just me saying it and pointing to the paw prints will create something. It's already creation. Something is already there by the time I say something. And when he sees a marten in real life, he needs to correct that thing he already has. Because when I say something, everything gets created in that person. And if somebody says something to me, something will get created. You see, the language is so intimately connected to the words, it's impossible not to get some perception. And this is what Wittgenstein said. perception is part of language as well. And in one very fundamental sense, the world is language. A word is a thing, because it creates something, even if it's not 100% correct, but it's a thingy coming with everything. So this whole idea with the separatedness between words and world, it run into problems somewhere, always. Let me just add, this is not something I figured out by myself. I would never come to these conclusions without Wittgenstein. So he is important, well, such is a lot of other philosophers, but I would say Wittgenstein is a pinnacle when it comes to sort of taking away the veil in front of your eyes, because the job he did is amazing, because he helped us, he paved the ground for not falling into this confusion, because it's rather terrible to confuse language itself. It will make knowledge very hard. It will be a bother. It will be a pain in the neck. It will take energy from you. Because every time you don't understand how words work, you will spend some extra energy. Even in daily life, I would say, this whole idea about having an extra world, it gets created in the same way. Wittgenstein heals language, and he does in this process also heal ourselves, so that we'll have a deeper understanding how language actually works and be able to use it much more elegantly, perfect, and be in the world always, also, I would say. I would say it actually brings you back to reality, to a balanced situation. So Wittgenstein could actually be compared to healer of people. I can give you an example here. In his scripture on certainty, he tries most definitely to unravel the problem of external world skepticism, showing that the very question of how we can know that there is a world external to our senses only arises if we misunderstand the nature of propositions such as "here is a hand" in actual life. Such propositions are not offered as knowledge that might be proven true or false. Wittgenstein's approach is not to say that external world skepticism is false, but rather to show that the very question of whether external world skepticism is true or false arises out of a misunderstanding of the language we use. If we absorb Wittgenstein's teaching, we do not come to settled solutions to the philosophical problems that haunt us, but rather we reach a state where these problems cease to haunt us. So he helps us to understand. Otherwise, it's so easy to fall in the trap we all fallen in. I would say most of humanity has this idea. When I say this is a hand, this is something that is a normal phrase in language and can be proven or disproven. A bit like to say that I have a body, or I exist, or the world exists. So you see here, even uncertainty, another book I was mostly using philosophical investigations. This idea of an external world is forcefully questioned. And once you heal, you become more satisfied in language of using it. That's also a difference. That's very important. And you will be led in life not to fall into misunderstandings. I don't want to get too philosophical today, but I'm rather sure that Wittgenstein meant that the question, does God exist or not, is not a legit question. It's a bit like saying, this is a hand, prove it or disprove it. And remember what I mentioned about the Martin. The Martin did give an image. Maybe you would say it's not a correct image. Well, it did give something. There's already a space occupied somewhere. I could even ask Kalle to draw that Martin that appeared in his mind. And it will actually turn out to be something rather than nothing. To have monosemism, my saying wouldn't produce anything in his mind because there is no intention according to this. He doesn't know what it is, so there can be no intention. That is not absolutely correct. And so many times in history that has been proven wrong by happenstance. When people went to New Guinea, I think it was, or somewhere, and they pointed at a monkey, what is that? And they got a reply that was, do you mean that? In their language. And that became the name of the monkey after that. So, words, two things. They are not floating away somewhere, and you can't really say that the intention was wrong or some way. That doesn't make sense somehow. There are so many examples of this thing. When people go to different places and they ask things pointing or a similar thing. And it's even so that he wants to end philosophy as an activity. But I would say it's rather that Wittgenstein wanted to reinvent philosophy. It should be something that helps people. That is what philosophy does, help people. Not ask questions that are unhelpful and actually can get people into a lot of troubles. I call this the private language argument, but it has different names and it's actually put in different animations, I would say. There was a small place. And for every new play, you understand the thing more and more. It's a progressive understanding. It never ends because language is not definite either. It's no end to the understanding of language or the use of the language. You can always get better. Whereas in this monosemic, you know all the words and then you're finished and you can give away your dictionaries of some sort. Hey, language is as big as the world. I think that's rather obvious. So language can't be smaller than the world. You can never say that language ended here. It doesn't make sense either. So get your intuition better. I think that is the secret message of Wittgenstein. You will heal. And once you heal, you will feel better also. You feel great sometimes when reading Wittgenstein. And it's a relief that goes through your whole system. This, when I understood this, I would say, not a literal side, but I really had a corporal/mind side that went through my whole system. It was such a great relief. And it lasted like a month or something. I just kept on smiling. And this is what Wittgenstein does. But it's not the only way to go about the history of monosemism. we mentioned before that cognitive sciences like neurology and artificial intelligence, they end up with a problem with monosemism. And that is this homunculus, that little figure sitting in our head and understands everything. And homunculus, oddly enough, started with vision, not language. But it could be applied as well with language. In vision, the idea that vision comes through the eyes, and it's somehow developed inside the head with a screen, and then you ask yourself, who's watching the screen? Well, it's the homunculus. What in the homunculus is watching what the homunculus sees on the screen. There's another homunculus, and there you go. But language is the same. There's something in yourself that understands what language is, and that's the homunculus. You see, similar methods could be used. In the cognitive science, this realization was not voluntarily, it was forced upon us because of technological development. We came to realize that it will not work ever. And then we have the permanent disjunction of meaning, and this is more of the style of Derrida, and actually what Saussure did say, unbeknownst to himself, if you dare to say that, which I just did. I took the liberty. A fourth way of looking at the whole thing is actually quantum space, because it does, monosemism does have actually arguments coming from quantum physics, and one of those things is quantum physics has shown us there is no such a thing as identity. Nothing in this world is identical to itself. And two things cannot be identical either. Those are those two rules from quantum physics. And that will also start a lot of problems with monosemism, because it actually claims that every time I use a word, it has exactly the same meaning. Exactly. And how nonsensical isn't that? That is actually sameness, the illusion of sameness. And if language were built that way, it would have been corrupted within seconds, with a self-implode or don't be anything else. You can also see this as an effect of space and time together, that the meaning-building factor in us, whatever that is sort of handing out energy from the reality to different places, to dictionaries and pointers. And in the end, you will end up with a lot of meaning in your head, so to speak. You have meaning for all the words, and you become blurred in the head. And I would say that that is very similar to hjärntrötthet, as we say in Swedish. I don't know what it is in English. But it's this tired feeling you get when you have too much meanings in your head. And you stop living in the world, in the space that you really are in. And you escape to some transcendental place where you have all these meanings instead. It's a little bit, now I'm in reality, I get too tired, I step out of reality, and here in this place I have meanings instead of reality. And these meanings is something I stick to, they are important to me. And in this process I lose a lot of energy. I don't get the energy from reality, from the presencing that Heidegger would say. And instead I have to make do with these proxies. And I have to invent them myself by splitting the word every time I speak. You can imagine that takes a lot of energy. And of course you don't always do that, but I say people who has this misunderstanding, they do it to a certain extent, some more, some less. but it's taxing on you. It brings you down in the end. And I think it brings you down literally, because you need to have a transcendental attitude. You need to leave your body, because you know in yourself that words means thanks to the different meanings. That means thanks to they are changing in meaning constantly. Because language and we people and reality, it's about action. It's not something static. And if it becomes something static, it's just the loss of energy, I feel. Because the world can never stop in that way. What happens is I get so tired from all meanings, I say to myself, it's stop now, because I can't handle it anymore. There are actually pointers, and I think that could be the fifth person I can make up. Ian McGilchrist would have said that meanings could actually cause you to get a one-way ticket to the Barmy bin, the loony bin, or some place like that. Because people suffering from schizophrenia, they are suffering from too much meaning. Everything means to them. Every single thing in the world has meaning. So if you speak to a schizophrenic and you say, like, good morning, they will say, good. And then they will say, morning, more. So this meaning becomes so engraved in them, so it becomes pathological, and you can't even communicate anymore with them. You can't play the same dance. Every word to them is mysterious and filled with meanings. And those meanings doesn't make sense to themselves either. It's like the most, you push yourself, and you become schizophrenic. And you think, now I invented my own language. Cannot. What you can create is confusion. You get so confused that you think you're saying something, but you can't even recognize what you're saying. And anyone who had a longer discussion with a schizophrenic person, you will realize they don't make much sense even to themselves. There's no line going somewhere else. It seems that way. Well, if you spend enough time, you understand there is no line, there's no understanding, there's no presence. They are just babbling on. And they don't know how to get out of it. So you see, Wittgenstein is a great healer, because schizophrenia is a new thing. And I'd say, thanks to this confusion that I think the world needs to know much more about, because it's damaging in the end. It's something severe. It's taxing. So I hope this could give you a little insight, this impromptu lecture about the history of monosemism. Just to remember, you can't really criticize. This sounds like criticism. No, you can't really criticize this. It's just a lack of understanding. So don't get me wrong. This is not a thing you can criticize, but you can get out of it. And getting out of it, you do that step by step. And language can always get better. It's a scale. So I think you who are listening or watching now are very far from being schizophrenic. So there's still a chance. But it's well worth looking at the YouTube, at the internet, some interviews of schizophrenic people, and you will notice the oddness in them. It's different. Nothing at start, but you notice after a while, this is not normal. You say, this is out of the extraordinary. Well, I'd say, well, there are tendencies of that. We discussed that earlier. Mathematics, these mathematicians who thinks there are existing things somewhere. Transcendentalism is very, very close to this monosemic problem, because there's, like, they say something that mathematical numbers have meaning somehow. And that meaning is permanent and stable somehow, somewhere. Well, I think that's my cue to end. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.